When you think of shows from the 2000s that define this generation, the first shows that pop up in this discussion are shows like SpongeBob, Ed, Edd n Eddy, or Kim Possible. Of course, there are plenty more, but there's one show in particular whose influence on modern humor and comedy goes heavily overlooked: The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy. Oh, and oh boy, it's Halloween. Now you're probably thinking, but Paper, what do you mean? Everybody remembers Billy and Mandy, it's a classic. And you'd be correct, but what I'm talking about specifically is how the show's use of dark humor and comedy was both influential to a lot of the jokes and humor we consume today, and just how ahead of its time it truly was. But in order to fully understand this, we have to talk about the show's origins. The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy was the brainchild of Maxwell Adams. Ever since his early career, he has shown a deep interest in the art of dark comedy. In his college film titled Billy and Mandy and the Trepanation of the Skull and You, it's clear that his vision for turning the most scary and unsettling things into humor has always been there. In that short animation, Mandy decides to trepanate Billy, which basically translates to drilling a big hole in his head and watching him bleed out. The humor comes from Billy's unaware and unconcerned reaction to all of it. Sure, it was gross and a bit uncomfortable, but that's the whole point of dark humor. In interviews, Adams said that he wanted to make sure that the kids were scared before making them laugh, and have the adults laugh at the jokes the kids wouldn't get. Now, this isn't to say that Billy and Mandy was the first ever show to use dark and more cynical themes. In fact, there was another Cartoon Network show, Courage the Cowardly Dog, that took all the things that shouldn't have fit onto a kid's network and put them there anyways. It was a show that told stories and made jokes from the darker sides of human thought. It was able to cover topics like abuse that couldn't have been told if they weren't allowed to be dark. Other networks like Nickelodeon didn't really have that edge, the only major exception being Ren and Stimpy. Cartoon Network always had that little bit of edge over its competitors due to the fact that they never treated their audience like children. Allowing the more cynical and edgy stories to be told required treating them with a higher level of intelligence than most would give them. So what made this show in particular so special? Well, I think there are three things that I should point to. It's timing, intelligence, and presentation. Or tip for short, I guess. The timing at which the show came out is one of my main arguments behind the title of this video. Remember those two shows I mentioned before, Ren and Stimpy and Courage the Cowardly Dog? Well, they had both ended before Billy and Mandy came out, and at that time all of the prevailing cartoons were using the humor those shows were using. When Billy and Mandy came out in 2003, there was quite literally nothing else like it on TV. This allowed it to stand out among your sea of more optimistic and less grim shows, pun intended. Imagine for a second being a kid in the 2000s, and after watching that new episode of SpongeBob, you decide to switch over to Cartoon Network, and are immediately greeted with this. Stay away from my eyes! The people who grew up watching Billy and Mandy are somewhere in their early 20s to late 20s, give or take. The amount of influence this show gave to its generation's humor is subtle, but when you take a closer look, are way more noticeable. When you look at how much dark humor has become one of the most popular forms of comedy, especially among millennials, it wouldn't be a far stretch to say that Billy and Mandy, at least, was partly responsible for this. How the show was able to turn these dark and uncomfortable themes into jokes, and using the technique of shocking the audience and forcing them to have no other reaction but to laugh, is scarily parallel to what a lot of stand-up comedians and online personalities do today. But the time the show aired isn't the only thing to take note of here, because the show's comedic timing is also what made it work so well. Timing is everything in comedy. The more a certain type of joke is said, the less funny it becomes. The less pauses and the less attention placed on when a joke is said, the more your jokes fall flat. Billy and Mandy was probably one of the funniest cartoons, to me at least, because its timing was always on point. Every scream, every hit, and every time Billy did something dumb was timed to absolute perfection. And it's a real case study in making jokes hit that much harder.
Right next to the Anvil Cactus Farm!
I mentioned this briefly a few moments ago, but Billy and Mandy was a show that never questioned its audience intelligence by dumbing down. There's always been this outside stigma against cartoons that since they're primarily made for kids, that there's no point in adding any complexity to them. They're not smart enough to get anything, so why should we pretend they have more than 2 brain cells? The show is jam-packed with adult humor, references, and cynical jokes that while may go over some kids' heads the first time, will make for an unforgettable rewatch. I mean, what other show would have the absolute balls to make Yogi Bear a crackhead?
Hey, little girl, come here for a second. That's a nice picnic basket you got there.
They never treated the audience like idiots despite them being mostly kids. And it also benefited from being made in a time where more adult themes were readily accepted in kids' media, which seems few and far between now than back then. Instead of playing it safe, Billy and Mandy introduced the generation to a whole new type of humor that wasn't really made for them anywhere else.
How you doing, Dad? I love you. I love you.
And then there's the final piece of the puzzle, presentation. How the show managed to fit references with dark comedy, parody, and sometimes gruesomeness, and at the end of the day, still have a strange sense of heart to it. And what makes these three characters so likable. I think the best way to do this is with some examples. The show is known for having its fair share of references to all kinds of media in its time. It's one of the main staples of the show, yet it never manages to overshadow the intent, which is making you scared, then making you laugh. A lot of shows fail to do this. When you see references or plays on other shows or movies, they often come off as corny. Billy and Mandy never falls into that trap, because instead of using them as a crutch, it uses references to further push the ideas and themes of dark and gross humor, and to show off the different relationships the characters have with each other.
This one fires gamma rays!
Take for example Hokemon, an episode which obviously references Pokemon. In this episode, Billy and Erwin are playing this monster trading and fighting game called Hokemon, and things take a turn when Grim agrees to turn them into real-life monsters.
What would you two weirdos do with real Hokey monsters?
We'd be like rock stars or news anchormen! Chicks would dig us!
But things quickly turn south when they take these monsters out in the open, and people see their powers. More and more people get real Hokey monsters, and they quickly get out of control and start destroying the city. It's a good episode because it makes you forget that this is supposed to be a reference to something. They could have named them something entirely different, and the quality of the episode wouldn't have changed. But the fact that they used this opportunity to pay homage to the original Pokemon is the icing on the cake. From shocking imagery for a kids show, to absurd-looking monsters and clever slapstick, this episode is peak Billy and Mandy.
And that's the news.
That's my favorite news guy.
Another example is Nigel Planter in the Chamber Pot of Secrets, an extremely obvious reference to the second Harry Potter book, Chamber of Secrets. Nigel Planter has to go back to Toadblatt's School of Magic while being hunted down by Lord Moldybutt.
Bingo.
The references here, while even more noticeable than the ones in Hokemon, never come off as heavy-handed. This is because it's used to push the overall narrative of the show. It's a continuation of a previous episode, also about Toadblatt's School of Magic. They use these references to tell a story throughout these two episodes, rewarding the viewer for keeping up. Now, I could just fill the rest of this video with me explaining all the referential moments, but that would take way too long, so I'll just speedrun a few more. Dum-Dums and Dragons, which references the popular board game Dungeons & Dragons, is all about Billy wanting to slay a dragon to become a hero, but instead befriending it, all while Hoss Delgado does Hoss Delgado things.
I don't work with idiots.
There's Nursery Crimes, which goes through a number of classic bedtime stories with an edgy twist to all of them, including one where Pinocchio tries to cook and eat Billy to become a real boy. Further introducing its young audience who recognize all of these stories to more dark and twisted versions of them. There's Tricycle of Terror, which references the Stephen King novel Christine, taking the absurd and slightly scary idea of a cute little tricycle becoming a violent murderer. When you take the absurdity of that situation, mix it with touches of horror and funny visuals and slapstick, you get the formula for a perfect episode of Billy and Mandy. But one of my favorite scenes of all time comes from the episode Fear and Loathing in Ennsville, when Grim and Dracula get lost in the desert and try to get home. When they run out of food, though, they decide to eat at Mother Scorpion's children. What happens next is comedy gold.
Well, maybe if you didn't make your baby so delicious, Dracula wouldn't have had to eat him. Ah! Ah! Ah!
You leave Dracula alone. Ah!
Oh, now you're scared of Dracula. You were afraid to find out what Dracula made of, because Dracula made of... Ooh.
Do I really need to say anything? Maxwell Adams and his team of writers changed the way a lot of people think about humor now. This one show in its 8 seasons has influenced a generation in a very big but subtle way, and it often gets overlooked by the bigger shows that came during its time. But I think it's time that I and many others in our little community give this show more flowers. It truly deserves it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, you know what to do. Have a good day, and take care.